My peaceful home was disrupted when my mom brought home a black boy. My family life had always been a picture of suburban tranquility. Our small home in a quiet neighborhood felt like a haven, tucked away from the chaos of the outside world. My parents, Linda and Robert, worked hard to create a stable and loving environment for me, my younger sister Emily, and our baby brother Jacob. Our days were filled with routines that were as comforting as they were predictable: family dinners around the worn wooden table, Sunday afternoon picnics at the park, and cozy evenings watching movies together. Life was peaceful. Life was simple. And, until that day, life felt complete. It all changed the afternoon my mother came home with Daniel. I remember it vividly, the sound of the front door creaking open, followed by my mother's cheerful voice calling out. I descended the stairs with Emily trailing behind, expecting one of her co-workers or perhaps a neighbor stopping by for coffee. Instead, there he was, a boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing awkwardly in the entryway with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was taller than me but younger, with dark skin and wary eyes that flicked around the room as though searching for a safe corner to retreat to. His clothes were too small, his sneakers scuffed and worn. He looked out of place. An uninvited guest in our carefully curated home. "This is Daniel," my mother said, her voice unnaturally bright. "He'll be staying with us for a while." My mother's expression softened as she stepped closer to Daniel, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Daniel's mother was a dear friend of mine," she began, her voice tinged with sadness. "She passed away recently, and Daniel's been through a lot. He was staying with his grandmother, but it wasn't safe for him there." Daniel's mother, Rebecca, had been one of my mother's closest friends. She was a single parent, raising her son with love and dedication despite the challenges. For years, my mother had spoken of Rebecca with admiration, her strength, her warmth, and her determination to provide for Daniel. But all of that changed when Rebecca was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She fought the illness with everything she had, but a few months ago, she lost the battle, leaving Daniel without a parent. Daniel was sent to live with his grandmother. What might have been a sanctuary turned into another chapter of suffering. His grandmother was elderly and impoverished, and her boyfriend was abusive. Daniel endured neglect and physical harm in their care. When my mother visited to check on him, she found him thin, bruised, and withdrawn. Unable to turn a blind eye, she decided to act. My father's footsteps echoed behind us, and I turned to see his face darkening as he took in the scene. "Linda," he said, his voice low and controlled. "We should have talked about this." I froze, trying to process her words. "Staying with us," I echoed, my tone sharp enough to make Emily glance nervously at me. The tension in the room was suffocating. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, retreating to his study. When my mother brought him home, I struggled to understand her decision. Our house, our lives, had always felt so stable and complete. Now, everything felt uncertain. Daniel's presence was a reminder of a world I preferred to keep at a distance, one filled with loss, pain, and upheaval. He was quiet, moving through the house as if afraid to disturb anyone. His shoulders hunched slightly, as though bracing for an impact. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were soft and hesitant. At the dinner table, he ate quickly, rarely looking up, and never asked for more, even when it was clear he was still hungry. Jacob, my younger brother, didn't seem to notice or care about the weight Daniel carried. To him, Daniel was just another boy, someone to play with and share toys. Watching Jacob's easy acceptance of Daniel left me conflicted. I envied his ability to adapt, but I also resented how quickly he had embraced this stranger. One evening, I walked past Jacob's room and heard the sound of laughter. It was light, carefree, and genuine. Peeking inside, I saw Daniel sitting cross-legged on the floor, helping Jacob build a train track. For a moment, Daniel's face was unguarded, his usual solemn expression replaced by a small, almost shy smile. It was the first time I'd seen him look like a normal boy. That image lingered in my mind long after. Daniel was a boy who had lost his mother, endured abuse, and been uprooted from everything he knew. Yet here he was, sitting on my brother's bedroom floor, trying to find a sense of normalcy. Daniel's arrival had disrupted my life, yes. But it also began to reveal truths I hadn't wanted to confront about loss, kindness, and what it meant to belong. For now, though, I clung to my anger, refusing to let it go, even as his quiet resilience began to challenge everything I thought I understood about family, loss, and belonging. From the moment Daniel entered our home, the fragile equilibrium of our family was disrupted. The tension between my parents hung thick in the air, growing sharper with each passing day. My father, Robert, was staunchly opposed to my mother's decision, and it showed in every clipped word and cold glance he threw her way. My mother, Linda, on the other hand, was unwavering in her resolve. She had made a promise to her best friend Rebecca, Daniel's late mother, and she wasn't about to break it. The arguments started almost immediately. They never erupted into shouting. But the quiet intensity of their disagreements was somehow worse. I often found myself lingering just out of sight, catching snippets of their heated exchanges. "You can't just bring a boy into our house, Linda," my father would say, his voice tight with frustration. "We have our own children to think about. Did you even consider how this would affect them? He's a child." "Robert," my mother would reply, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "He's been through more in his short life than most of us could imagine. I couldn't leave him in that house, not after seeing how he was treated." "And now what?" my father retorted. "We upend our lives for someone else's child. What about our family, Linda? What about us?" My father, Robert, couldn't seem to reconcile himself with my mother's decision to bring Daniel into our lives. It wasn't that he disliked Daniel personally, it was more about what Daniel represented, an intrusion into the stability and predictability that my father held dear. My mother, Linda, on the other hand, saw Daniel as a child in desperate need of love and security, and she couldn't bear the thought of turning him away. Their conflict played out in moments that became increasingly hard to ignore. At first, it was subtle, tense silences at the dinner table, pointed glances exchanged when one of them mentioned Daniel. But soon, the arguments began to spill out into the open, their voices cutting through the walls of our home like jagged glass. "I'm telling you, Linda, this isn't working," my father said one evening as he paced the living room, his voice low but taut with frustration. "You can't just make a decision like this and expect everyone to fall in line." "I didn't make this decision lightly, Robert," my mother shot back, her tone just as sharp. "You know what Daniel's been through. How could I turn my back on him? And what about our kids?" he countered, gesturing toward the rest of the house. "Sarah's been acting out. Emily's completely withdrawn, and Jacob, he's too young to understand what's happening. This isn't fair to them. What's not fair is leaving a child to suffer when we have the means to help him." My mother replied, her voice rising. "Daniel deserves a chance, Robert. He deserves a family." Their voices clashed like thunder, and though they tried to keep their arguments behind closed doors, the walls were thin. Daniel wasn't oblivious. I caught him lingering near the staircase one night, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor as their voices drifted down the hall. "He hears everything," I said quietly to my mother the next morning, my tone uncharacteristically soft. "You're trying to make him feel welcome, but all he hears is you and Dad fighting about him." She sighed, her expression weary. "I'm trying, Sarah. I'm doing the best I can. But your father, he's so stubborn." My father's stubbornness soon turned into something colder, a quiet withdrawal. He stopped engaging in arguments altogether, instead retreating to his study for hours at a time. The absence of his voice at the dinner table was almost worse than the sound of their fights. It was as though he had resigned himself to living in a house that no longer felt like his own. This Cold War between my parents left a heavy mark on all of us. Emily became even more reclusive, burying herself in her books and avoiding family interactions whenever possible. Jacob, oblivious to the deeper issues, tried to bring everyone together with his usual cheerful antics. But even his boundless energy couldn't bridge the growing divide. Daniel, for his part, seemed to shrink under the weight of it all. He grew quieter, more reserved, as though trying to make himself invisible. He started spending more time outside, sitting alone on the porch or wandering aimlessly in the backyard. I once found him in the garage, staring at a broken bicycle that had belonged to Jacob years ago. "You can ride it if you want," I said, trying to sound casual. He looked up, startled, and shook his head. "It's fine," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to cause any more trouble." His words hit me harder than I expected. For all my initial resentment toward him, I couldn't deny that he didn't deserve the tension that had engulfed our family. He was just a boy who had lost his mother and was trying to find a place where he belonged. And instead of making him feel welcome, we had made him feel like a burden. The breaking point came one evening when my father's frustration finally boiled over. Daniel had accidentally knocked over a lamp in the living room while trying to grab his homework from the coffee table. The crash was loud, startling everyone in the house. My father stormed in, his face dark with anger. "For God's sake, can't you be more careful?" My father snapped, his voice harsher than I had ever heard it. Daniel froze, his eyes wide with fear and guilt. "It was an accident," my mother interjected, stepping between them. "He didn't mean to." "That's not the point," my father shot back. "This house used to feel like home, Linda. Now it feels like a battlefield." Daniel's head dropped, and he muttered a soft apology before slipping out of the room. I wanted to follow him, to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I watched as my parents stood there, the silence between them heavier than the shattered pieces of the lamp on the floor. Their conversations always ended unresolved, with my father retreating to his study and my mother turning her focus back to managing the household. But the undercurrent of conflict permeated everything, making even the simplest interactions feel charged. For me, the disruption was more personal. I couldn't see Daniel as anything but an intruder, someone who had upended the delicate balance of my life. He was quiet, almost too quiet, his presence marked more by the space he occupied than anything he said or did. At meals, he sat with his head down, eating quickly and silently. His reserved demeanor should have softened my resentment, but instead, it fueled it. His silence felt like an accusation, as if he knew how little I wanted him there. Emily, my younger sister, seemed largely indifferent. She had a knack for staying out of the fray, retreating to her room with a book whenever the tension in the house became too much. Jacob, on the other hand, embraced Daniel with the unreserved enthusiasm only a young child could muster. He saw no outsider, no disruption, only a new friend. Watching the two of them play together stirred something uncomfortable in me. A mixture of jealousy and guilt that I wasn't ready to confront. The weight of my father's disapproval bore down on the rest of us. He rarely addressed Daniel directly, but his displeasure was evident in the way his jaw tightened whenever Daniel entered the room or the way he sighed audibly at the dinner table. My own resentment mirrored his. I began treating Daniel with a cold politeness, keeping my distance and avoiding unnecessary interaction. "Why does he have to stay in Jacob's room?" I asked my mother one evening, unable to mask the irritation in my voice. "He's not part of this family." My mother's expression hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. "He's here because he has nowhere else to go," she said firmly. "And until you're old enough to make decisions for this family, you'll respect mine." My mom's words stung, but I refused to let her see how much. I turned on my heel and retreated to my room, slamming the door behind me. In the silence that followed, my frustration simmered, threatening to boil over. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the way his presence had exposed the cracks in our family. Cracks I hadn't even realized were there. Even though Emily maintained her neutral stance and Jacob's innocent joy softened the edges of the tension, I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was irreparably changed. Daniel was a constant reminder of how easily our peaceful life could be disrupted, and I resented him for it. Yet, beneath the layers of resentment, a small voice whispered that my anger wasn't entirely fair. But I wasn't ready to listen, not yet. My resentment toward Daniel didn't just simmer quietly, it manifested in small, deliberate acts designed to make him feel unwelcome. If I couldn't convince my parents to send him away, I thought, maybe I could make him want to leave on his own. It wasn't my proudest moment, but at the time, it felt justified. After all, he had upended my life without so much as a word. The first prank was simple enough. I switched the sugar with salt before breakfast. As Daniel took his first bite of cereal, his face contorted in surprise, though he quickly composed himself. "Is something wrong?" I asked innocently, watching him struggle to swallow the tainted spoonful. "No," he said quietly, pushing the bowl aside without further complaint. His calm reaction only fueled my frustration. Next, I made sure to misplace his shoes, hiding them under the couch where they wouldn't easily be found. When it was time for school, Daniel looked around the house, searching silently while my mother grew increasingly flustered. "Sarah, have you seen Daniel's shoes?" she asked. "No idea." I replied with a shrug, suppressing a smirk as Daniel eventually had to borrow an old pair of Jacob's sneakers that were too small for him. Yet, even then, he didn't complain. He walked to school with his head down, enduring the discomfort without a word. The more I tried to get under his skin, the more it irritated me that he didn't react the way I expected. When I swapped the labels on his notebooks for school, hoping to cause confusion during class, he quietly fixed them without telling anyone. When I poured water on his bed, forcing him to sleep on the couch, he simply laid out a blanket and went to sleep as though nothing had happened. Each time, his calm demeanor acted as a mirror, reflecting my own childishness back at me. "Why don't you ever stand up for yourself?" I snapped at him one evening, frustrated that my efforts had no visible impact. He looked up from his homework, his dark eyes steady and unflinching. "Because it's your home," he said simply. "I'm just here." His response left me stunned, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I quickly buried it beneath my anger. "Maybe you shouldn't be," I muttered, storming out of the room. Despite my hostility, Daniel remained an enigma. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, kept to himself, and helped around the house without complaint. My mother, oblivious to my schemes, praised him for his manners and maturity, which only made my resentment grow. My father's cold indifference toward Daniel was the only thing that seemed to align with my own feelings, though he expressed it in silence rather than action. Jacob, however, adored Daniel. The two of them spent hours playing with trains, building tracks that sprawled across the living room floor. Watching them laugh together made my stomach twist. It wasn't fair that Jacob accepted Daniel so easily when I struggled with every fiber of my being to tolerate his presence. One evening, as I watched Daniel and Jacob play, I overheard my mother talking to my father in the kitchen. "He's been through so much," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The least we can do is give him a safe place to stay." "And at what cost?" my father replied, his tone sharp. "This is tearing the family apart. Have you even noticed how distant Sarah has been?" "She'll come around," my mother insisted. "She just needs time." I clenched my fists, anger bubbling inside me. Time wouldn't fix this, I thought. The only solution was for Daniel to leave. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as I was walking home from school, a group of classmates cornered me in the park. They had been teasing me for weeks, but today their jeers turned into shoves. My bag was yanked from my shoulder, its contents spilling across the ground. "What's wrong, Sarah?" one of them taunted. "Too good to hang out with us now." Before I could respond, Daniel appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He stepped between me and the group, his shoulders squared and his expression calm but firm. "Leave her alone," he said. The leader of the group sneered. "What are you gonna do about it?" Daniel didn't answer with words. Instead, he stood his ground, unwavering. His presence alone seemed to unnerve them, and after a few tense moments, they backed off, muttering insults as they walked away. "Are you okay?" he asked, turning to me. I nodded, too stunned to speak. As we gathered my things, I noticed his hand trembling slightly. He had been scared, I realized, but he hadn't let it show. He had stood up for me when I had done everything to tear him down. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind. Daniel could have ignored what was happening. He could have let me face the consequences of my own actions. But he hadn't. Despite everything, he had chosen to help me. For the first time, I began to question my behavior. My pranks and sabotage hadn't driven Daniel away, they had only highlighted my own insecurities. He had shown more strength and kindness than I ever had, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The hostility I had clung to so tightly began to waver, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Admiration? Perhaps both. All I knew was that things couldn't stay the same. Something had to change, and maybe that something was me. The shift in my feelings toward Daniel didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like the melting of ice under the spring sun. A gradual transformation that caught me off guard. After the incident at the park, where Daniel stood up for me despite all I had done to push him away, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His quiet strength, his unwavering kindness, it began to gnaw at the edges of my resentment. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the porch, fiddling with one of Jacob's broken toy trains. The sun cast long shadows across the yard, and his face was a mask of concentration. Without thinking, I sat down next to him. "What are you doing?" I asked, my tone softer than it had been in weeks. He glanced at me, surprised but not unkind. "Fixing this," he said simply, holding up the train. "Jacob really likes it." I watched as he worked, his fingers deftly piecing the tiny parts together. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us feeling less like a barrier and more like an invitation. Finally, I said, "You're good at that." He shrugged. "My mom used to fix things all the time. She taught me." Hearing him mention his mother for the first time made something tighten in my chest. "What was she like?" I asked hesitantly. His hand stilled, and he looked out at the yard. His eyes distant. "She was strong," he said after a moment. "She worked hard, even when she was sick. She always told me to be kind, no matter what." He smiled faintly. "She loved sunflowers. Said they reminded her to always look for the light." I didn't know what to say. The weight of his words settled over me, and for the first time, I saw Daniel not as an intruder but as a boy carrying the weight of a world that had crumbled around him. From that day on, I found myself seeking him out more often. We started spending time together, small moments that felt monumental in their simplicity. I helped him with his homework. And he showed me how to fix more of Jacob's toys. Slowly, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. It wasn't just me who began to change. My newfound connection with Daniel seemed to ripple through the family. Jacob, of course, had adored him from the start, but now Emily began to join us, her usual indifference replaced with curiosity. She would sit with us on the porch, asking Daniel about his favorite books or teasing him about his terrible drawing skills. Even my father, though still distant, seemed to soften slightly. He no longer avoided Daniel's gaze at the dinner table, and once, I even caught him handing Daniel a wrench while fixing the leaky sink. I wanted to do something to bring us all together, something that would help my father see what I had come to understand about Daniel. So, I suggested a family dinner. At first, my mother looked surprised, but she quickly agreed, her eyes lighting up with hope. The night of the dinner, I helped Daniel set the table, arranging candles and placing a small vase of sunflowers in the center. "Your mom would like these," I said, nodding toward the flowers. He looked at me, his eyes soft, and said, "Thank you." As we all gathered around the table, the atmosphere was hesitant but warm. My father sat at the head, his expression unreadable, while my mother beamed, clearly pleased by the effort. Jacob chattered excitedly about his trains, and Emily rolled her eyes at his enthusiasm, though her smile betrayed her amusement. Halfway through the meal, my mother gently prompted Daniel. "Daniel, would you like to share something about your mom? I think we'd all love to hear about her." Daniel hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, but then he set his fork down and folded his hands in his lap. "She was amazing," he began, his voice steady but soft. "She worked 2 jobs, but she always made time for me. She used to read to me every night, even when she was tired. She'd make these pancakes on Sundays, with chocolate chips and whipped cream. She said they were special, just for us." He paused, his gaze fixed on the sunflowers. "When she got sick, she didn't stop smiling. She said we had to find the good in every day, no matter how small." The table was silent, everyone listening intently. My father cleared his throat, his usual stern expression softening. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Daniel nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She was." After dinner, as we cleared the table, my father placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, it felt like Daniel wasn't just a guest, he was part of the family. Later that night, as I sat on the porch with Daniel, I realized how much had changed. He wasn't the intruder I had once resented. He was someone who had faced unimaginable loss and yet found a way to keep going. He had taught me more about kindness and resilience than I ever thought possible. "Thank you," I said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. He looked at me, puzzled. "For what?" "For being you," I replied, surprising even myself with the sincerity of my words. He didn't say anything, but the smile he gave me was enough. For the first time in a long time, our family felt whole. In the end, Daniel became an inseparable part of our family. Though the journey to get there was anything but smooth. The tension and conflicts that had once threatened to tear us apart eventually gave way to a quiet understanding and, later, a profound bond. Daniel's presence challenged us, forcing each of us to confront our biases, fears, and expectations of what it meant to be a family. He didn't just integrate into our lives. He enriched them, bringing a quiet resilience and kindness that reminded us of what truly mattered. For me, the transformation was deeply personal. I learned to see beyond my initial resentment and fear of change, discovering a depth of empathy and acceptance I hadn't known I was capable of. Daniel taught me that family isn't defined solely by blood but by the connections we nurture and the love we choose to give. Through him, I realized that strength comes in many forms, in the bravery to start over, in the patience to heal, and in the courage to love again despite loss. As I look back now, I see how much we all grew because of Daniel. Our family isn't perfect, it never was, but it's stronger, more compassionate, and more complete. And for that, I'll always be grateful. Family, I've come to understand, isn't about who we're born with but about the people who walk alongside us, bringing light and strength even in our darkest moments.